Okay, I think we are ready to get started. Again, welcome to this week's office hour for ESG and ESGCV. My name is Marian Goldburn, and I am today's moderator. If you're just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and the region you represent. As a reminder, this office hour session is being recorded for public record. A copy of the slide deck and recording will be emailed to all attendees. Next slide, please. To ask a question, please submit questions in the chat box. Please type your organization and question in the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and will provide answers if possible throughout the presentation. All questions and answers entered into the chat box will be recorded as part of the public record. Next slide, please. Today's agenda will include some announcements, some ESG and ESGCV updates, our office hours update, ESG and ESGCV Q&A, and our spotlight series on indirect costs. Next slide, please. We have some announcements. HUD has released a new onboarding toolkit for ESG funded staff. We will drop that link in the chat to view the onboarding toolkits. Each of the new onboarding toolkits provides a series of informational training videos and resources to orient and train new or transitioning staff who serve as grant administrators, program directors, rapid rehousing supervisors, and rapid rehousing case managers. Many videos have a brief knowledge check question at the end to reinforce learning. Who should use the onboarding toolkit? Any staff that is working directly with individuals experiencing homelessness, and also any individuals who may have fiscal responsibility. Each toolkit also comes with a template job description, and we will drop that link in our chat. Next slide, please. And now I will turn it over to Connie for our ESG updates.
Good morning, everybody. All right, 2022 NOFA applications. We are on track to release the NOFA and the applications for the 2022 allocation the end of May, the end of this month. Webinars will follow about a week after that, and you will receive information about that in just a few weeks. So 2021 applications for those that received awards. We have already begun routing contracts. Not all of them, but some of them have started the routing process. So we're in pretty good shape about getting you some executed contracts here within the next couple months. Those are 2020 contracts. Please reach out to your ESG rep if you are struggling to spend. There's not a lot of time left, only a couple months. July 7th is the expenditure date. We've already had some meetings with some of our grantees and been able to help them in with maybe a budget revision or just help them think through some ways that they can expend their contract, their money. So be thinking about that and reach out to us if you just want to meet on Teams and we can talk about it. Next slide, please. And this is just with the ESG, our annual team, we are now requiring that we could really pay attention to personal identifying information, or PII, when you submit your request for funds and your detailed expense reports. Please do not give us the client's name, rather identify them with an HMIS number or another unique ID number. So we don't want any personal identifying information on those detailed expense reports. And if we ask for any backup documentation from you, we do ask that you redact that. And I know that you can do that electronically now. And if you go to the next slide, just some definition on redacting, and I know everybody knows what that means. But I also want to let you know, I'm really excited that we now have a secure site for you, our ESG grantees, to drop your backup documents that we may ask for, whether that's through our request for funds monitoring, which we've been doing since the first of the year. And also we'll have be doing some annual monitoring for some 2018 contracts here coming out shortly. So hopefully all of you that have 2020 contracts have received an email from your rep alerting you, letting you know that you're going to be receiving an email probably tomorrow or Friday from our IT department, giving you a link to go in and access your secure site for your 2020 contract. So we wanted to give you a heads up so you didn't, it would be an email you wouldn't recognize who it was coming from, but there will be an email coming from our IT department. If you didn't receive that email from your rep, or you're not sure what we're talking about, reach out to your rep, or you can reach out to me or the NOFA box, and we would be happy to talk you through that. But again, we're going to have a secure site for all of you that have contracts with us. Anytime we ask for any backup documentation through any kind of monitoring and so forth, that you'll be able to not email that to us anymore, but rather put it in the secure site. And the next slide, please. And again, just reminding everybody who our ESG team members are, they're here and ready to help you. And any questions always can come in through that ESG NOFA at hcd.ca.gov. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Connie. And now I have just a few ESG CV updates and reminders. In order to meet HUD's 50% expenditure deadline in June, please submit an RFF to your grant administrator via email by June 2nd. Please include as many expenses as possible. And as a reminder, you must redact all personal identifying information for clients in your backup documentation. For example, the name, the addresses, etc. Any submissions of RFF with client PII will be returned for changes. Next slide, please. And now we have some HCD office hours updates. We will put this link in the chat where you can access the training site and some upcoming office hour topics. On May 18th, we will have HDIS and HMIS. On May 25th, we'll present a training on rent reasonable and fair market rent clinic. On June 1st, we will have our diversity in COC leadership with a focus on people with lived experience, LGBTQ+, and racial equity. And on June 8th, we will have our authentic engagement of persons with lived experience training. Next slide, please. And this next slide covers our COVID response resources. Next slide, please. And this next slide also has some resources for our ESG links. Next slide, please. Okay, so if we have any questions, again, if you can put those in the chat and we will answer them either in this training or on follow-up if we're not able to. So I don't believe we have any questions yet in our chat. Next slide, please. And so if you have any further questions, please contact us. We can be contacted if it's for annual ESG. Please reach out to your ESG representative or email at esg@hcd.ca.gov. And if you need to reach out to your grant administrator for ESG CV, you may also do that. Next slide, please. And now I will turn it over to Chris Pitcher to introduce our speaker today for our spotlight training on indirect costs. Chris?
Thank you, Marion, and thanks everyone for joining us. I'm going to take just a brief moment here to set up today's conversation. We have had several conversations around indirect costs. And we see that as a continuing need as these questions continue to arise. So a few changes today. The first is that instead of Tyler Bridges from MDG, we will have David Munoz. So David, get ready to wow us with your indirect knowledge. But before that, the other change that you'll notice is that we have changed the name of this series from Brown Bag to Spotlight. And I want to highlight what that is and why. It came to our attention that the term brown bag has been used historically and is underpinning, has racial underpinnings, specifically in inter and intra racial discrimination. So that's discrimination of white folks on Black folks, and also the colorism around racism within the Black community as well, having lighter skin, darker skin. And the brown bag has been used historically as a potential measuring tool. I encourage folks who are interested in this topic to go learn more, but we felt it was very important to remove that name as soon as we were made aware that there was this historical designation to it. So we are now calling this the Spotlight series. I get to use some of my cool graphics from my from going to concerts and such. So we're going to call this Spotlight moving forward. It's the same format though. We're going to have a short presentation today from David Munoz, and then a chance to interact. So you can interact with us verbally. You can come off mute. You can raise your hand. We'll unmute you. You can put it in the chat. So anything you are wondering about indirect costs today, we'll do our darndest to get to it. So with that, I am going to move into our first ever Spotlight series with David Munoz. David, would you mind taking us to the next slide, please?
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. As Chris had indicated, we'll be discussing direct versus indirect costs. And similar to the previous Spotlight series, this will be really at a 50,000 foot level. We'll try and just kind of refresh everyone's memories on some of the basics, and then we can really dive into the questions that you all have. So to start us off, we define a direct cost versus an indirect cost, which are the two types of costs that you must have. A direct cost is any cost that can be identified specifically with a final cost objective. And so a final cost objective example would be, your ESG CV grant, your ESG grant, your CDBG grant, and so forth. And essentially, in order for it to be considered a direct cost, you should be able to tie a hypothetical string between the cost and the action or the outcome. So if you're paying for a participant's rent, you should be able to provide a check that says this paid for, Motel 6 for this applicant or this beneficiary. And that way you're able to tie that string. Indirect costs, on the other hand, are costs that are incurred for a common or joint purpose, which benefits more than one cost objective. And it's not readily assignable to that cost objective that specifically benefited. And really what that means is that the particular action or outcome really benefits more than just one funding source or more than one final cost objective. And so if you're really looking for a definition of this must be a direct cost and that must be an indirect cost, unfortunately, that definition does not exist. Really, depending on the structure of your organization, individuals' roles, the functions, that cost, may change depending on the agency or the organization. The thing that is important for you, although, is that you must be sure that you're treating all of your direct and indirect costs in a consistent manner across all funding sources. So if your human resources department is an indirect cost for the ESG CV program, they must be treated as such across all of your other federal funded programs. Next slide. So although there is no strict definition of direct and indirect costs in terms of specific items of cost, here are a couple of examples that you'll most commonly find. So for direct costs, the payroll costs, which would include salaries and benefits for staff that implemented an eligible ESG-CV activity. So the case management services, street outreach, housing stabilization services, and so forth. The purchase of supplies and materials that are used solely for the ESG-CV program could be charged as direct costs, and direct awards or participant support costs, such as rental assistance for eligible ESG-CV beneficiaries. Then under indirect costs, we have rent and utility costs for the facility where you're doing all of the management administration of not just the ESG-CV program, but probably others. Same with accounting and administrative staff, because they are doing the payroll for your entire agency, and your agency may not just be focused on implementing this ESG-CV program. They're really benefiting the entire organization as a whole and not just the ESG-CV program. And to that end, you wouldn't be able to kind of demonstrate or easily demonstrate the amount of time that your accounting and admin staff directly benefited the ESG-CV program, which is why in that case, it would be treated as an indirect cost. Computers and software, generally indirect costs, but again, if you're purchasing, that computers or that software exclusively for the ESG-CV program, you would need to document it as such, and it could be treated as a direct cost. And so that's an example where you and your agency need to determine how it is that you're going to treat those types of costs, and then just ensure that you're consistent about it throughout all of your grants. And then lastly is internal auditing costs, because they're checking your agency's books across the board, not just for the ESG-CV program. Next slide. So this graphic really helps, I think, give you an idea of how to treat or how to bill personnel costs, and whether or not your personnel costs should be treated as direct. And if they are, how do you determine where to bill, or if they should be treated as indirect? So starting from left to right, if you have a staff member that is exclusively dedicated to the ESG-CV program, then 100% of their salary and benefits can be paid for or can be charged as a direct cost, and you can get reimbursed for that. A second example, under staff member B, maybe they work on the ESG-CV program 50% of their time, and they work on another federal program, or maybe just another program that you have the other 50% of their time. Well, 50% of their salaries and benefits would be an eligible direct cost under the ESG-CV program, and which you could get reimbursed for. But again, in order to document that, you're going to need timesheets that show the amount of hours directly spent on the ESG-CV program versus those not, which allows you to create that hypothetical string between the cost, which is the employee's salary, the amount of time they spent, and that's why you're able to get that paid for as a direct cost. Indirect costs would be, your payroll and human resources department, which processes the payroll of all of your agencies or your organizations, accounts. That may include the ESG-CV program, but it will also likely include various other accounts. And so for the most part, we don't see that the payroll and human resources departments are directly tracking on their timesheets how many hours it took them to process this specific grant's payrolls. And so that is why it's treated as an indirect cost. And so long as it's treated in that way, in a consistent manner, you should be fine. So the next slide. So there are three indirect cost options. The most common one is the 10% de minimis, and the other two are the indirect cost rate or the cost allocation plan. If you will be utilizing the indirect cost rate or the cost allocation plan, you must submit a copy of your negotiated rate or the cost allocation plan that was approved by a cognizant agency. So for the most part, if this isn't a route that you all are deciding to go, you'll develop that cost allocation plan. You'll submit that to your cognizant agency, and your cognizant agency is generally the federal department that you all directly receive the most amount of funds from. So if ESGCV or ESG or CDBG or home is your, comprises the most amount of federal funds that you receive, then HUD would be your cognizant agency. And really, if HUD's your cognizant agency, it becomes the Department of Health and Human Services. So your cost allocation plan should be submitted to them on a yearly basis, and they will then approve what your indirect cost rate is, which is expressed as a percentage. If your agency is not utilizing one of those two methods, then you're likely going to be utilizing the de minimis. And you can only utilize the de minimis if you do not have an indirect cost rate agreement or a cost allocation plan that's been approved by a cognizant agency. If you have one of those two, you must utilize that rate. If you're utilizing the 10% de minimis, though, the neat thing is you do not need to submit any additional documentation for those indirect costs. Because it is a 10% that is applied to your modified total direct cost, which is a portion of some of your direct costs. And we'll kind of get into that in the next slide. So, as it says on the slide, the indirect cost rate is not applied to the overall ESG or ESGCV award, but rather the direct cost base, or what is known as the modified total direct costs. So if you had a grant of $100, it doesn't mean that you would multiply that $100 or apply the indirect cost rate of 10% to the entirety of the $100. It's possible, but it's not guaranteed. So what you would do is you would look at the definition of modified total direct costs in 2 CFR 200, and it explicitly defines what is included in that cost base and what is excluded. So things that are included are things like salary, benefits, services, transportation, and supplies, as well as the first $25,000 of each subaward. Things that are excluded are participant support costs, and that's a big one. Capital expenditures and things of that nature are also excluded. That definition is very clearly defined and should be utilized every time if you're utilizing the de minimis method. If you're utilizing one of the other two methods, your cost allocation plan or negotiated indirect cost rate agreement will define what your modified total direct costs are and let you know these are the costs that you need to include in this pot that can then be multiplied by whatever your percentage is. And that is how you would arrive at what your total indirect costs should be or that are eligible for reimbursement. Next slide, or do we have, sorry. Do we have any questions? I'm sorry, I don't have the chat thingy.
Nope, nothing this time, David. You can keep on moving.
All right. So modified total direct costs, again, this kind of breaks down that definition that I was referencing that's in 2 CFR 200.1. Where the definitions are located. So direct salaries, wages, fringe benefits, supplies, materials, services, travel, up to the first $25,000 of each subaward. And then those items that are those costs that are explicitly excluded from that calculation are equipment, capital expenditures, participant support costs, rental costs, and then the portion of each subaward in excess of $25,000. One thing to kind of note, and just to be perfectly clear, there's a difference between a cost being an eligible direct cost and an eligible modified total direct cost. So all of the costs under the right table, under not MTDCs, those may be eligible direct costs. They just don't get included in the calculation for the amount that gets multiplied by your percentage. So if we go back one slide, this formula says there's only a certain pot or a direct cost base that gets multiplied by your percentage to arrive at your indirect costs. And so if we go back down, the costs on the right hand would be excluded from that calculation, but not excluded from your reimbursement request as a whole. So important distinction there. And next slide. ESG CV grantees using the cost allocation plan or a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement may use a different cost base to determine their indirect cost rate. And so therefore you may have a different definition of MTDCs, but in all of the agreements that we've seen that have been approved by a cognizant agency, the first page explicitly states what your rate is, when the start date is, when the finish date is, as well as what your agency's definition of MTDCs will be with respect to applying your rate. ESGCV grantees are not required to seek reimbursement for indirect costs. And then lastly, subrecipients should contact HCD if they have any questions about indirect costs and or should contact their grantee administrator. And I believe that is it. So the floor is open to you all.
Thank you, David. Not Tyler, obviously. Thank you, David, for being with us. You can go ahead and take the slides down, Taylor. That's fine. I have a few questions for you, David, that I'd like to give you a chance to talk through. The first from Micah, can you elaborate on the subaward of 25,000? Is that cap applied to the annual budget? So can you just explain that a little bit more, that subaward piece?
Yeah, so a subaward is generally understood as a subrecipient agreement. And so that subrecipient agreement that you have with an agency would be considered as one subaward. Now, how you choose to structure your subrecipient agreements is very much up to you, and it differs from agency to agency. So for instance, some agencies enter into one subrecipient agreement for, let's say, $100,000. And in that subrecipient agreement, they lay out the scope of services to say, we're giving you $25,000 to do street outreach, 25 for rapid rehousing, 25 for HMIS, and 25 for admin. So they're really, providing 4 different types of services, but under one subrecipient agreement. And as a result, you're only able to get the first $25,000 of that subrecipient agreement into your modified total direct cost pool, which then gets multiplied by 10%. So you really end up with $2,500 worth of indirect costs. Now, the alternative to that would be your agency decides to enter into 4 separate subrecipient agreements at $25,000 a piece for each of those individual activity components. And at that point, you would be able to include the first 25,000, in which case all 4 agreements. And so you'd be able to then receive $10,000 in indirect costs, because 4 agreements times 25,000 is 100,000, times 10% is 10. Does that answer the question?
I believe it does. I believe it does. Thank you, David, and that was great. You can just pull that math off on the top of your head. So we have another question from Anne, and I think you can just I think you just said some of this, but if you can just say it again, what are the definition for modified direct costs? So can you just go back to that particular topic and hit it one more time for me?
Yeah, and so if you type in 2 CFR 200 on Google, it'll pop up like ecfr.gov. That website is your friend. And at 200.1, they have the definitions, and the beauty with Google is you can use Control F. So if you go to modified total direct costs, it says it means all direct salaries and wages. And so again, direct salaries and wages, applicable fringe benefits, materials and supplies, services, travel, and up to the first $25,000 of each subaward, which we just discussed. But MTDC excludes equipment, capital expenditures, charges for patient care, rental costs, tuition remission, scholarships, fellowships, participant support costs, and the portion of each subaward in excess of $25,000.
Thank you, David. And you got a thank you in the chat also from Anne. Elena asks, do participant support costs include security deposits and rental subsidies paid to landlords?
Yes. So if we again go to that 2 CFR 200 .1 for the definitions, you can again type in participant support costs, and that defines it as direct costs for items such as stipends or subsistence allowances, travel allowances, registration fees paid to or on behalf of participants or trainees in connection with conferences or training projects. So yes. And one really neat tool that HUD has put out is the ESG COC Indirect Cost Toolkit, where it actually goes through each activity category and tells you which eligible costs within that activity category should get included as an eligible MTDC versus not. So that's another resource that I would certainly direct you all to.
Thanks, David. We'll try to get that in the chat while we're entering this next question from Veronica. And I think this is a question you can probably answer. For our RFF reporting, the modified cost rates apply to our subcontractor expenses or only to our incurred expenses as the subrecipient. So it's that sub level. Do you want to just describe that? I know you've done a good deal of work on this particular topic.
Yeah. So when you're thinking about your indirect costs and what your direct versus what your indirect costs for your agency are, as we kind of started this conversation, we said what your direct costs may not be what another agency's direct costs are. They very much differ based on from organization to organization. And so when you're going through this exercise of what are my modified total direct costs, what is my indirect cost rate, that's how you arrive at your indirect cost amount. And so you're, anything that is a subaward, you've already got, if you're doing de minimis, you've already got the 10% of the first $25,000 of that subaward. So that's your indirect cost that you're able to seek reimbursement for. But that is separate and distinct from your subrecipient's indirect costs, right? Because your subrecipient may have, let's say, a federally negotiated indirect cost rate or a cost allocation plan. And their modified total direct costs or their base may be defined slightly differently. They may have a different percentage rate. And so when they bill you, they will have done that math to say, these are our modified total direct costs, this is our percentage, and that's how we arrived at this total indirect cost amount that we are billing you now for, right? And then when you process their RFF, and now you add your agency staff costs to process that RFF, to administer the grant, those are, you know, all your direct costs now to HCB. I'm not sure if that makes sense. I know that's kind of a long-winded way, and I wish we could like draw things on here, but it's
we do have a new whiteboard feature, David, that we could actually draw some things out. I'm not sure we're prepared to draw this this morning, but we could consider that in the future. I have another question from Andrea Curry. Andrea, you've got a pretty long question here. It's pretty, I think it's pretty much focused on the conversation, the comment that David said about being consistent, and that you have a situation where things are done a little bit differently. I think I'm going to ask you to come off mute and ask that question, Andrea. Are you still with us?
I am, yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, gotcha. Go ahead and ask.
Okay, great. So we have some costs that we consider direct shared costs. So they are, or they're considered direct shared costs in our accounting system. And we have other federal funding, specifically federal funding that's administered or subrecipients of Cal OES that they administer it within the state. And they consider those direct costs as long as they are split by this allocation set that we have had to have, you know, it's a written out allocation set plan that they, you know, they monitor, they approve and everything. So they consider them direct costs. We were told by one of our ESGCV program specialists that those need to be considered indirect costs for ESGCV. So I'm not clear on whether or not that means we're treating them differently. We're still using the same allocation set to split them with ESGCV figured into that allocation set. It's just that on the actual RFF or invoice, on one, we call it a direct cost, and on ESGCV RFF, we call it an indirect cost. Is that okay to do? Are we treating it differently, or are we being consistent?
Yeah, that's a great question. And certainly one that we may want to follow up on just to make sure I understand kind of all the moving pieces. But the gist of why the cost needs to be treated in a consistent manner is if, let's say, you directly charged rent to Cal OES and ESGCV, and that rent was split 50-50. And then you considered the rent for that same office building as an indirect cost, you would be getting multiple, you know, sources of funding to pay for that rent twice. Does that make sense?
It does, and no,
okay.
Yeah, that does make sense. And no, we wouldn't be doing that at all. Like, for instance, it would be like our phone and internet bill for our office. It's split based on all the FTEs that work in that location. And, you know, so I think our ESGCV split on it is like 4.12%. You know, that's based on the FTEs in that location. So that 4.12% would not be going to anything except for ESGCV at all. It's just that whatever portion of it went to that Cal OES grant would go on the Cal OES invoice as a direct cost, whereas it would go on the ESGCV RFF as an indirect cost. So no, there would never be duplication of expensing that, you know, whatever portion of that specific bill. It's just that it falls in a different column on the two invoice RFF.
Yeah.
And so
it seems like you're billing it as a direct cost.
Yes. Well, that's what we considered until we were told a while back when we tried to put it on an ESGCV RFF, we were told, no, that needs to be indirect.
Gotcha. And there may be certain activity specific or activity component specific requirements with respect to the eligible costs for that activity type. And again, that's why I was like, we may want to kind of discuss this where we can really get under the hood. Otherwise, I may be steering you in the wrong direction.
I got you. I'll send you a specific example by email so that it makes a little bit more sense.
Thanks, Andrea. I knew your question was going to be detailed, so thanks for coming off mute and talking with us. Thank you, David, for that answer. And it is good to probably connect one-on-one on some of these more difficult questions. I think I have a handle on Rock's question here. If not, Rock, please come off mute and help me. Rock is working in a county that are not claiming any indirect costs. However, their subrecipients are billing for indirect costs. In the toolkit, the ESG and COC and ESG CV program toolkit, which is now in the chat if you need it, it breaks down eligibility of what can be included in MTDCs by component. Some components have transportation as eligible, but motor vehicle as ineligible. So how does this apply to costs such as Uber or Lyft, vehicle leases, staff mileage, and gas?
Yeah, I mean, we would probably have to go through that exercise together on an activity component by activity component to kind of assess, based on what the end goal of, that activity component, why it may be treated as a eligible MTDC versus an ineligible MTDC. But think about transportation in the context of, is it transportation being used by your staff, your agency staff, or is it transportation for beneficiaries, in which case that would be treated more like a participant support cost, right? The travel stipend or the travel allowance. And so that is an example of why it may be treated as an MTDC in one case and not an MTDC in another. So again, figuring out what it is that cost really is. Is it for participants or is it for our staff? And so going through that exercise.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it, David. Thank you very much for that. Rock, if you need additional help, David and your ESG-CV grant administrator will be happy to talk you through some of this stuff. This is the final question I have at the moment, David. So we'll ask this and see if there's anything after that. This is also from Elena, a follow-up. Subrecipients at every level are also entitled to charge 10% de minimis rate on their MTDC. Is that correct?
Subrecipients have the option of choosing the 10% de minimis rate so long as three things happen. One, they don't have any approved federally negotiated rate or a cost allocation plan that's been approved by a cognizant agency. So number one. Number two is that should be in their standard agreement or your agreement with them that they're, you're allowing them to have a 10% de minimis rate for indirect costs. The third one is leaving my mind. But yes, the third thing is when you bill HCD, make sure that they're treated as direct costs and that you're making that translation and that you're not including that in your indirect cost calculation.
Thanks, David. And that is our last question. So if anyone has any other questions, feel free to raise your hand and come off mute or put it in the chat. I think I have a question for you, David, and this is my curiosity, and I think folks will probably also see this. As you've done a good deal of work on indirect costs across California, what are some of the common things you're seeing that folks can think about now to get their indirect costs correct?
Well, I think the biggest one is definitely differentiating between your indirect costs and your subrecipient's indirect costs and not conflating the two is, I think, the biggest one. And then the second thing is, think about your budget and don't think about ESG-CV as your only source of funds that is really funding the activities that you all as an agency implement, because you want to maximize your indirect costs. So look at the MTDC list, maximize your ESG-CV budget in those specific categories so that you can maximize the amount of indirect costs. And for those that are excluded, if you have them, leverage these dollars to get those outside funding sources to pay for those costs. And maybe those other funding sources allow you to apply some, indirect cost rate to them, whereas this program does not. And so playing to the strengths and the weaknesses of each funding source that you have is super important and not seeing them as a vacuum.
That's very good guidance. Thank you, David. One last question from Maria. I believe this goes back to not last response, but your previous response to that. What if there is no mention of indirect costs in the agreement?
You may want to just have that cleaned up. If they're going to be, or if they have been charging indirect costs, definitely want to have that included in the agreement. If they haven't charged indirect costs to date, but they do, you may be able to get away with just kind of leaving it alone. But yeah, I would say have it in the agreement would be the safest bet.
Yep. Great. Thank you, David. Maria, I hope that was helpful. Last call for verbal questions, or anyone wants to come off mute and ask a question to David, or join in the discussion around indirect costs. All right. I'm not seeing any. David Munoz, thank you so much for joining us and talking to us again about indirect costs. Your work has been valiant in this area and very, very valuable to the state of California and to my understanding of indirect costs myself. I've been through several of these sessions and I still am not crystal clear. It's very complicated, and I think we'll probably be in this content again at some point. So thank you for being with us. One last question. Ben, go through your grant administrator and we'll get you connected to David and the MDG. That's the easiest way to do that, so that we can make sure that everyone that needs to be looped in is. So if you have a question about your indirect costs, go to your ESGCV grant administrator and we will coordinate with David and get him to all the communities that have questions on this. Thank you for that question. And thank you all for joining us this morning for our Spotlight series and our office hours. We'll be back at it next week. Until then, have a great rest of your week.